Hello everyone, I'm Angel and today I'll be talking about two important legal concepts under tort law: strict liability and absolute liability. These doctrines help us understand how liability is assigned in cases involving harm caused by inherently dangerous activities, even when there may be no fault involved. We'll start with a quick introduction to the concept of no-fault liability, then move into the details of strict liability and absolute liability, including the landmark cases. After that, we'll compare the two doctrines and end with some key takeaways. Now, starting with the introduction, tort law usually needs either negligence or intention for liability, but not for always. There are some cases where a person can be held responsible even if they didn't mean to cause harm or even tried to prevent it. This is called as no fault liability. Now, in the context, the key principles come from two landmark cases: strict liability from Rylands and Fletcher, and absolute liability from MC Mehta versus Union of India. While they sound similar, both strict liability and absolute liability, they may sound similar, but absolute liability is stricter and doesn't allow for any defenses, unlike strict liability. Now, starting with the concept of strict liability, which was evolved from the case law of Rylands versus Fletcher. Now, according to this principle, if defendant keeps or brings hazardous substance on his premises, and then he will be held liable if substance escape the premise and it harms plaintiff. Although there is no negligence on the part of defendant, he has no intention to harm another person. In simple words, it basically means that strict liability is something that if you bring something dangerous onto your property and it escapes and causes harm, you will be held liable even if you took precautions. Now, the strict liability have essentials. First is the dangerous thing. Second, it must escape, and third is the non-natural use of land. Now let's take an example. If someone owns a Rottweiler dog, and that has known history of aggression, that the dog is very, or you can say that extremely aggressive, and even after keeping it in a fenced area, it escapes and bites a neighbor. Now, in this situation, the owner can be held liable under strict liability even after taking due precaution. Now, this is a landmark case, Rylands versus Fletcher, 1868, which established the case strict liability. Now, the facts of Rylands versus Fletcher. Now, Fletcher had a mill which required energy sources for which there was a need to construct a reservoir. He hired some independent contractors and engineers for the construction. Now, Rylands owned certain mine shafts which the contractors didn't observe, and because of this, the water reached the mines and destroyed the Rylands land, for which he suffered loss and sued for the same. Now, the issue arose here that can the defendant be held responsible for the another's party action that causes an entity to leave his property without his knowledge or consent. Second issue was whether liability should attach simply because the defendant's non-natural use of land created a risk that once materialized caused damage. Now, the House of Lords gave their judgment in favor of defendant. The court ruled that if someone through their use of land stores something that is likely to cause harm, if it escapes, they are strictly liable for any resulting damage. In a nutshell, in this case, Fletcher built a reservoir, but water from it ended up flooding Rylands coal mines through forgotten shafts. The question was, can someone be held liable when a dangerous substance escapes even without the direct negligence? The court said, yes, since Fletcher's land was used in a non-natural way and the stored water was dangerous once it escaped, so he was strictly liable. Next case is MP Electricity Board versus Shell Kumar. Now, in this Indian case, this reinforced the idea. A man died after being electrocuted by a live wire lying on a rain-soaked road. The electricity board argued that a third party may have caused the wire to fall. But the court said that no, if you're handling something inherently dangerous like electricity, you're strictly liable. You can't hide behind third party acts. Now, this strict liability is a kind of liability which have some exceptions, like plaintiff's own default, which means that there is full fault of plaintiffs. Second is the act of God, like a natural disaster, or if a third party caused it, or if the plaintiff consented to the risk, or if the act was under the statutory authority. These exceptions provide some flexibility, and this is where strict and absolute liability start to differ, because in absolute liability there are no exceptions. Coming to the absolute liability now. It emerged from Indian jurisprudence, especially after the industrial tragedies like Bhopal gas leak case. But the key case here is the MC Mehta versus Union of India. The idea is simple, that if a company is doing something inherently dangerous and harm is caused, they are liable. No excuses, no exceptions will be taken into consideration. Whether precautions were taken or not taken, it doesn't matter. Public safety comes first here. Now, it also has some essentials, like there must be a hazardous substance, escape, non-natural use of land, mischief. And an example is also here that if a chemical plant producing toxic substance causing an accident such as spill or explosion, harming residents or the environment, the company would be absolutely liable for the damage. Now, the landmark case, MC Mehta versus Union of India. Now, in 1985, Oleum gas leaked from a fertilizer plant in Delhi. The leak caused health issues, panic, and environmental damage. Now, the court decided that industries dealing with dangerous substance have an absolute and non-delegible duty to ensure safety. So, when something goes wrong, they're fully liable even if they tried to prevent it. So, in this case, there was a leak of toxic gas that spread into the surrounding area, leading to extensive harm to nearby residents, environment damage, and long-term health issues. And this incident came at the time with public concern over industrial disasters were heightening, especially following up the Bhopal gas tragedy, which means that this case was followed up by the Bhopal gas leak case. Now, the Supreme Court of India has given the judgment that enterprise operating the hazardous plant liable. The court ruled that when a business engages in an inherently dangerous activity, it has an absolute and non-delegible responsibility to the public. The liability arises automatically and in the event of an accident, regardless to the precautions taken. Another case is Indian Council for Environmental Action versus Union of India. Now, this is another significant case here. Toxic chemicals were discharged, polluting an entire village. So the court could not only held the industries responsible, but also made them to pay cleanup costs and shut them down for violating environmental laws. This case shows that absolute liability is not just about compensation, it's also about the accountability and environmental justice. This is a key difference between strict and absolute liability. So, in strict liability, the liability is imposed regardless of fault, but certain defenses are available. In absolute liability, liability is imposed without any exceptions. It is an absolute. The word itself say that it is an absolute liability. There are exceptions like act of God, statutory exceptions, plaintiff's own default, but in absolute liability there are no exceptions, no excuse. Burden of proof is always on defendant when we're talking about strict liability, and when we're talking about absolute liability, the burden of proof is always on the plaintiff. Element of escape is necessary in strict liability. That dangerous thing must be escaped from the land of defendant. But in the absolute liability, it's not necessary that particular element or particular dangerous thing must escape from the premises. Now, it is often applied in product liability, transportation of hazardous material and certain torts. Absolute liability, it is common in cases involving environmental damage, hazardous waste disposal, or catastrophic accidents. Lastly, to wrap it up, strict and absolute liability are crucial in tort law when dealing with hazardous activities. The main difference is that strict liability has exceptions but absolute liability doesn't. These doctrines shift focus from just blaming someone to actually protecting society from dangerous enterprises. Now, these are the books and websites that I referred, including R.K. Bangia text and some trusted legal blogs like Law Bhumi and Upgrad Law.